In this Edpuzzle, we're going to be covering an IRB application and the assignment that you have relevant to that content for this week. So just as a brief outline for what this whole Edpuzzle is going to look like, since we're covering a little bit of content in addition to simply the instructions. We're going to start by looking at what an IRB application is, if you've never heard of one or know why we have them, which is what we'll cover second. Briefly go over some of the history of why we developed and started IRBs in the first place. Then I'll show you what the assignment for this week looks like. And we will then review the main ethics that you need to keep in mind and think about as you complete the assignment. Next, more specifically, I'll go into some of the specific questions on the application that you'll have to answer, and we can talk a little bit about them and what you need to be thinking about in terms of your design and ethics as you're coming up with an answer to those. And then we'll just generally go over the assignment expectations for this IRB application assignment. So what is an IRB application? Well, IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. And every single university or research institution or agency has one of these. And the purpose of this board is that it oversees all of the research conducted on human subjects and on animals to make sure that we're protecting the rights and the welfare of the participants and that we're doing valid and ethical research design. So saying that this would be an actual research proposal that you're writing, before you would ever be allowed to interact with participants or do anything to do with your study, what you would have to do is you would have to fill out an IRB application and submit it. And along with that application, you also submit your research proposal, which is what you all just finished the first draft of. After you submit it, the IRB board, which depending on how big the institution is generally 1 to 5 people, will review the application and they will either approve it or more often they will come back with questions or needs for clarification or things that you need to change to help protect the ethics of your participants. So really all these applications are just a number of questions, and the assignment that you're doing this week is an actual excerpt from one of the applications. It's about 3/4 of an application that we use for research on human subjects. And so when you're going through this application and answering the questions that we're going to go over here, we have to make sure that you're taking into consideration and explaining how you've taken into consideration the ethical guidelines that guide how we design research on human subjects. And so why do we have these review boards? It's not just another hoop to jump through. We have a pretty muddy and terrible history as far as research goes before these boards existed, wherein people were conducting research that had value, but they were violating some of the basic rights of participants. And so we've highlighted these rights and we have to make sure that we consider them. And so you probably learned about some of these in, say, your intro psychology course, your history and systems in psychology, or if you conducted and completed the city training in the research methods course. But here are some of the most infamous ones that the Belmont Report was published and covered. So this first one is the Stanford Prison Experiment. And so generally the idea behind this experiment was to look after World War II at why people that are put into power, i.e. the Nazi soldiers that were doing terrible things to some of the prisoners, why is it that as soon as you put someone into power, they start behaving differently and treating people differently? And so in this experiment, they essentially took prisoners that were within a prison. They didn't really have any voluntariness to participate. All the prisoners participated, and they made some of the prisoners guards, and they made some of the other prisoners prisoners. Guards were just prisoners acting as guards. So essentially they're role playing, and then they watch them over days and weeks to see how these two groups change in their behavior. And so unsurprisingly, the guards kind of grouped together and started doing, not great things to the prisoners. And so this study had an issue with, one, using a vulnerable population, being prisoners, because they're locked in a prison and don't really have any voluntariness when it comes to participating. And they were also causing them undue harm by letting the experiment continue on after the role modeling or the role-playing guards started to do terrible things to them. Another one is this Humphreys Tier Room study. And so essentially this person was just going into bathrooms and spying on people. And so they were collecting data on people in these bathrooms where they're expected to have privacy, and they weren't telling them about it. And so that was an issue with consent, deception, because he was speaking to them in the restroom, but wasn't telling him he was a researcher. And then also privacy, because you have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're using the restroom. Milgram's obedience study you've probably heard about. So this caused undue harm to the participants. This was another one that was spurred by World War II and the treatment of Nazis to some of the other populations. And essentially that just looked at what people would do if they were being told by an authority figure to harm someone else. And so they took these people and they told them that they were harming these other people. And even though they really weren't, just the psychological trauma of thinking they were harming these people did undue harm to the participants in that study. And so that was one of the issues with that one. And so we have a couple other ones, the Tuskegee syphilis study, a really terrible study when it comes to the history of research. Essentially, they were taking vulnerable populations, which were low SES populations and the rural South of African Americans who had syphilis, and they were essentially just tracking the development of the disease over time. The issue was they didn't tell this population what they were doing, and then after the cure for syphilis came out, which essentially was just antibiotics, penicillin, they didn't tell them that the cure was available, and they didn't give it to them because they wanted to see what happened to the illness over time. And so they caused these participants undue harm and unnecessary deception in the face of the researcher. Another big one that we talk about when it comes to the history is the tens of experiments that were done concerning human radiation. And so there were a lot of radiation experiments that were done with participants' consent. You know that radiation is one of the largest treatments for cancer right now, and we had to figure out how to use it somehow. But before we started getting consent from these participants, they were doing these experiments on people actually and exposing them to radiation without them knowing what was going on. And so all of these hoops, quote unquote, that you have to jump through when you go through research have a very strong background in solid rationale for why we have to do things like informed consent, and why we have to very carefully select our participants and how we treat them. So the application that you'll be completing has a number of different questions. I think the excerpt that I gave you is just 23 questions in general. And so I'll show you what the worksheet looks like in a second. But most of these questions is going to include an explanation of how you're going to ensure a certain ethic. So how are you going to make sure that you maintain your participants' privacy? Or how are you going to make sure that that their participation is completely voluntary? Things of that nature. Some questions are simply going to provide context for your study to allow the IRB reviewer, who's pretend in this case, but to really assess your design and what's going on. And so some of the questions are going to ask you things that you can just take out of your research proposal that are relevant to your procedure. For instance, how you're going to recruit participants or what your research question is. And so there's some questions you can just grab from your proposal and don't really have to elaborate on. There are also some yes or no questions that you may answer no to and not have to give an explanation behind. And so as I said, when appropriate, you can copy paste from your research proposal, and we'll go over some of these questions specifically in a second. But first, I'm just going to show you what this application looks like. So typically you would fill out this application in an online portal. And it would just be like a web-based fill-in-the-blanks application on a web page. But here, I have taken part of that application. This would be an expedited application for human subjects. And so you just answer them and fill in these answers here in the worksheet, and then reattach this worksheet after you've filled everything out to the submission portal in Canvas. So as you can see, the first 3 questions of this you can just grab right from your research proposal, and there's no paraphrasing necessary. So the full title of your study, that's simply the title of your paper. Enter a short title for your own personal reference. That's essentially a running head. These are just literally from the IRB application itself, so you can see what it looks like. Your answers to these are easy. Describe in lay terms the purpose of the research, including your research question and what you hope to gain. So that essentially is the one research idea paragraph that you have at the end of your introduction, where it says your purpose, your research questions, and your hypotheses. So that's something, again, that you can just copy paste in here. Once we get to some of these other questions a little bit later on in the application, this is what's really going to prompt you to explain specific parts of your procedure and the decisions that you made, and how you took into consideration some specific ethics. So now in the PowerPoint, we will go over some of those specific ethics and look at the individual questions themselves. So for all of you that did the research method sequence here, either with me and Dr. Miller does the CITI training as well. CITI training is essentially linked with IRB, and that was the training that you did in an online module that took you through all the ethics of research, and we did this in Psych 315, so the first part of the method sequence. And so you learned all of this stuff through that CITI training, but obviously it's been a long time since you've done it, and a couple of you did not do methods with us, and so you might not have even done CITI training, and that's totally fine. There's a lot of places where if you need more elaboration or background on this material to help you when you're completing this application, that you can go. So the first place and the easiest place for you to go after this Edpuzzle is to your textbook. And so chapter 3 in your Stanger Research Methods book outlines and goes into detail and explanations all of these ethics and participant rights that we're about to talk about. And so I recommend that you just reread that chapter before getting started. But at the very least, you should have the chapter next to you and use it for reference as you're completing the application to see what types of things you should be thinking about and talking about in your responses to these questions. So let's go over the basic rights that are guaranteed to all human subjects that are participating in research. And so the first basic right, as was outlined by the Belmont Report, which essentially was when IRB was created, they talked about all the issues and how we were going to solve them. The first basic right is autonomy. And so individuals must be given the choice whether to participate in research. They must be provided with sufficient information and possess all the mental competence to make that choice. And so participants have to, 1, volunteer for research without being coerced, and then they have to have the mental capacity to be able to volunteer for that research. So anyone with a diminished decision-making capability, say someone with learning disabilities, or perhaps a young child, or perhaps someone under the influence of a substance, we can still collect data on these participants, but we have to take special care to make sure that they understand what's going on and that they understand this is 100% voluntary and that they can quit participating at any time they want. And so it has to be the decision of the participant, and they can't feel coerced at all. So that's autonomy, and that's one of the big things behind informed consent, is when they give those informed consent forms to participant, it explains the entire study, and then it asks them if they want to participate. Along that same line is voluntariness, and so a lot of these will run together. So they must feel free to choose to participate in research. And so if I, as your instructor, asked you to participate in my research study for course credit, that would not be voluntary. I essentially would be coercing you to participate in my study because I'm offering you course credit. And so that would kind of violate that ethic there, but people must feel free to end their participation for any reason without consequences. So although it's inconvenient for us researchers, If someone wanted to stop halfway through your study, that's totally fine, and we have to allow them to do that. And we have to also explain that to them, that they can stop coming or stop in the middle of the questionnaire or stop whenever they want to. And so people must be given the free choice whether to participate, and it has to be completely voluntary, and that voluntariness has to remain throughout the entire duration of participation. These next two also run together. So benefits is the idea, similar to medical doctors, that we want to do no harm to our participants if possible. Now, depending on the research question in the study, some risk or harm might inevitably come to participants. So we have to make sure we maximize the possible benefits in our design, the benefits to the participants, and minimize the possible risk to participants, however possible. The benefits of the findings must always outweigh the risks to participants. And so if you're doing something that's really high risk, it might not be an ethical study to do. But take, for instance, the studies once they finally started getting consent on radiation. While there was considerable risk to those participants, the benefit that ended up being saving essentially millions of people's lives or prolonging their lives as a result of the findings of that research and the ability to use radiation outweighed it. And so participants consented and voluntarily agreed to do that. And even though it was high risk to them, the benefits outweighed it. And so that was a study we were able to do. Justice means that the benefits and the harm must be equally dispersed across groups. So there should be no individual or no population that's exposed to the risks of a study while others receive the benefits. And so you really, if you say, for instance, you wanted to break up an experiment into genders, you would not want to give the women one thing. The women, say you want to give the women a instructional protocol that helps them in school. Okay, so I give the women extra training in their course, and then I give the men in this course a control. I don't give them anything else. Okay, so they don't get the benefit. So the women are getting the benefit, but the men aren't. That would not be a valid or an ethical research design, because I'm singling out a group and giving them the benefit and not giving the other group the benefit. What I would have to do is mix up males and females and give a random group of males and females the instructional protocol, and then give a random group of males and females the control and not give them anything. So we can't isolate groups and benefit one without benefiting the other. We have to spread everything out evenly across all people participating in the experiment. So let's look at some of these questions. These are the first three questions that I already showed you in the actual worksheet itself, and so this can just come directly from your research proposal. The fourth question is when we start to get into the ethics and the thought behind the design of your experiment. So the question number 4 asks you to describe how human subjects will be involved. If there is any intervention or interaction with the subjects, fully describe what researchers and subjects will do. Describe any procedure being performed already for diagnostic or treatment purposes. And so essentially, you can't really copy paste this from your procedure, but you can, it's similar to your procedure in that you're just going to explain everything that researchers are going to do and everything that participants are going to do. And IRB needs to know this to make sure that you aren't doing anything to participants that are going to be coercive or pose undue harm or anything like that. And so what do we mean when we say interactions or interventions, and what do we mean by human subjects being involved? Well, when we come to data through intervention or interaction with the individual or identifiable private information, that's what we need to describe in this section. And so when we're talking about collecting data on participants, anything that you do that's collecting data from participants Data is about whom and not about what, when you're collecting anything about them, or if you're having them do anything, being the intervention or the interaction. So let's look at that a little bit more. What would constitute an interaction? Well, that would include any communication between the researcher and the participant, or the participant and the material. The communication doesn't have to be face-to-face. Your experiment might be entirely online, and that still constitutes communication and still constitutes an interaction. So online surveys are still considered interactions that need to, and so those need to be described here. Participant observation, if you're just watching them, that's an interaction. And so these are the types of things we need to be thinking about and describing. All of y'all's procedures and experiments are pretty straightforward, and so it shouldn't be too hard to identify the things that you need to describe here. What would constitute an intervention? Well, anything physical you have them doing, any types of measurements that have to do with the brain function, or behavioral interventions, or anything that you literally have the participant doing is going to be an intervention. So we have to make sure we describe all of those things here in this question. And so really this is just a more detailed explanation of parts of your procedure. So what would constitute private information? And so that comes to describing any personal information or data you are collecting from your participant. And so determining what constitutes private information that would need to be held confidential and protected versus general information that you don't have to protect and essentially is general knowledge is important to know, because we're going to have to identify what private info you're collecting in your study, and then you're going to have to explain later when we get to confidentiality how you're going to keep it safe. And so a private info would be considered information about behavior that occurs in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place. And so if they tell you information about what they do at home in their spare time, well, they could reasonably expect that to be private information because there aren't people sitting there watching them most of the time. So any behavior that's done in private or covert behaviors or anything to do with that person or their personal information that you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at them. And so it goes further into this description here, and this is just literal verbiage from the IRB that further states that private information must be individually identifiable. That is, that the identity of the subject is or may be readily associated by the researcher or associated with the information in order for obtaining the information to constitute research involving human subjects. And so that's just essentially saying that the private information that you're collecting on them is associated with their person in some way. And so usually we have to do that when we're conducting research, mostly so that we can run statistical analyses. And so if you were to use an example to show you what wouldn't constitute under this, if you were just watching people at the mall and you didn't know any of their personal information and you were just counting the number of times that you saw random people scratch their head as you're watching in the mall, okay? That's not really private info. One, because they're not in a private place and they're doing a covert behavior, so they know that everyone can see them doing that. And two, it's not associated with them, with their personal identity. So you're not getting their name and then writing down how many times they scratch your head. In this example, we're just counting how many times people in general scratch their head without knowing who they are. But most everything in all of the designs that I've seen in your experiments is private information, and so all of that's going to have to be protected and explained once we get further on in the application. So number 4, you're just explaining who is doing what. So again, another kind of elaborated explanation of what's going on in your procedures when it comes to experimenters and participants. Number 5 is who will be doing what. And so this is an easy question for you guys because essentially it's only you in this experiment. But in the real world, when you're running a study, you have a lot of different people engaged in the same experiment. So you might have one person collecting data, you might have another person recruiting participants from a school, you might have a third person giving assessments to the parents of the school, and so you might have a lot of different people involved in the procedure of your experiment. And so for IRB purposes, you need to outline exactly who everyone is doing what, and that's to make sure that there's no coercion going on and that everyone has been IRB certified through city training. But in your case, you can just say that you're the one doing everything. And so this is an easy answer to this question. You can just say the researcher and then say your name will be X, Y, and Z. No one else will be interacting with participants. So this is easy for you, unless you want to get creative and have some other people doing parts of your procedure, and that's totally fine. You just have to say that here. So another thing or reason that we have this question on your IRB application is to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest. And so again, in this pretend scenario with your research proposal, there is no conflicts of interest. But in the real world, it's very important for the IRB to understand if there are any conflicts of interest, such as the example before, where I, as your teacher, am recruiting you for participation for course credit. That would be a conflict of interest since I'm your teacher. But also conflicts of interest oftentimes have to do with funding when it comes to the research world, since all of these, most large studies are funded by national organizations or agencies or universities. And so we don't have to worry too much about this one, but just to know that it is something that IRB takes very seriously. So the next question, we're now getting to the portion of the application that has you describe things about your informed consent. And so one thing to think about in number 6, the question states, will the study involve deception or concealment of any information? And so remember that sometimes deception is necessary in research. You don't want to, in all instances, tell the participant what you're doing, because it might affect their behavior, which might then affect results. So if you've ever read about, say, double-blind placebo trials, that's where you have some people taking a drug and you have other people taking the placebo, but you don't tell them which one that they're in. And that's necessary so that we don't get placebo effects affecting the findings of some people. And so to have deception when it's necessary is totally okay, but here you have to describe what the deception is and why it's necessary. So I can't really think of any from your procedures in this class that are using deception, but don't take me at my word. You might have some deception designed in there, and so if you do, you need to explain it and why you have to do it. Which is pretty easy. And then if you don't have any deception, you can literally just say no to this question. Protecting vulnerable populations. So are any vulnerable populations included in your research? Indicate which of the following populations will be included, if so. And so the list that follows are all the populations that IRB considers to be, quote, protected and need extra rights and considerations over the rest of the public. So pregnant women, human fetuses or neonates, prisoners, children, cognitively impaired persons. So perhaps if you're looking at a study with individuals on the autism spectrum, or participants that might have been diagnosed with some other learning or different disorder. Students and employees are protected, minorities, economically or educationally disadvantaged, populations with AIDS or HIV, or terminally ill subjects. And so some of these might sound familiar when you think back to the history of some of the studies that we talked about that we're preying upon or using vulnerable populations. And so it's okay to do research on these populations, but we just have to take extra precautions to make sure that they understand that their participation is voluntary and that we're not doing them any undue harm. And so if you say yes to any of these populations, yes, I'm using children, or yes, I'm using cognitively impaired persons, or both. Here in the next one, you have to describe the steps that will be taken to ensure additional protection of the rights of these people indicated above. And so say you're using cognitively impaired persons, you might just explain that you have an individual going through consent with them and making sure that they understand it. Or if you're using children, you might say that you have, written your informed consent to be at the first grade level reading so that children can read it and that their parents will go through it with them. As I'll tell you when we get to the end here, there is no right or wrong answers to these things, at least in your case, since we're practicing. It's really just about critical thinking. So I want you to think critically, if you do have one of these populations, about how you will make sure that you maintain all of their rights as a participant. If you're dealing with pregnant women, then how are you going to make sure that you don't cause them any undue harm? The answer might be that, well, the pregnant women are only filling out our questionnaire, and so there might not be any risk of additional undue harm to them. And so that's fine. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. You just need to think about it and then try to come up with something. The next question was, will participants who will be recruited, be doing the recruitment rather? And if a supervisor or a teacher is recruiting participants, how are you going to handle perceived coercion? And so thinking back to all of your recruitment and participants, again, I'm not sure if you have like a boss or a teacher, or anyone that's going to be recruiting participants. A lot of you are just using flyers and recruiting the lay public. But if you did, again, it's okay if you're a supervisor or a teacher recruiting participants, but you just have to make sure that your presence is not coercing them to participate. And so if I were to recruit you all for a study, I would essentially, usually I have other people do the recruiting for me, or I just make sure that I step out of the room so that I can't see who's signing consent, who's agreeing, and who's not agreeing. Even looking at people or being present in the room, if you're in a position of power or authority over that person, even being in the room while they sign consent can sometimes be coercive because they feel pressure to consent because they think that you're looking at them. And so here again, you need to consider who's doing the recruiting. Is that person in a position of power or authority in any way over potential participants? And if so, how will you make sure that that doesn't affect their voluntariness when it comes to agreeing or disagreeing to consent? And so again, there's no right answer here. You can come up with some things, but generally you just have, if you do have someone in a position of power or authority over the participants, you have someone else give the recruitment materials, you make sure that you're not around for informed consent, things of that nature. Will enrollment be limited to a specific ethnic, social, or gender group? If so, describe and justify. So this comes back to justice, that ethic that we talked about when it comes to spreading out the benefits and harm of your study across all groups evenly. Now, considering the research question that you might have, that's not always possible. If you're interested in looking at why a certain group of people act a certain way, then the use of one specific group, ethnicity or gender group or sexual orientation or something of that nature might be justified. But you need to explain that here and why. And so if the answer is no and you're just recruiting everyone everywhere, then you can literally just say no to this question and go on. If the answer is yes, if you're only looking at a certain group of people, if that's part of your inclusion criteria, then you need to say yes, you need to describe who you're limiting it to, and then you need to explain why. And really that will just come down to your research question. Why is it necessary to only look at these people? Now we come to justification for the number of subjects that you want to use. And so we discussed this briefly when we were doing the first part of your methods. how many participants do you want? And so I mentioned earlier that you don't want to just recruit 5,000 participants, right? There is always some amount of risk associated with participating in a study, even if it's just, maybe the questions on the questionnaire, making them feel uncomfortable, or making them miss 10 minutes of work to participate in your questionnaire, right? So there's always something. And so we don't want to recruit a really big number of people if we don't need it. But you do have to recruit a sample size that's large enough to conduct your study and have validity and be able to do your statistical analyses. And so here, you're just going to outline, you're just going to state how many participants you are recruiting, and then you're going to explain why. And so in your participant section in your methods, you didn't necessarily explain why, and that's fine. You don't need to explain it there, but you need to explain it to your IRB reviewers here. So say you might need 100 participants, 50 in each group, to make sure that you can conduct statistical analyses. Or you might need 200 participants because you need to end up with 100. And since your study involves 3 months of visits and participation, you're expecting some people to drop out of the study since that's their right. And so you're just recruiting a large sample size in anticipation of people dropping out. And so whatever the answer is, it can be all of these things. You just need to explain the number and how you came to it. Once we get to question 14, we're looking at the time commitment for each participant. So if you're using a multiple different populations or different groups and they're doing different things, say one's doing this program or another's doing that program, then you need to outline specifically how long it's going to take participants in each group to complete participation in your study. And so you have some of the details about this in your procedure. And so essentially you just need to kind of grab those from your procedure and explain them here. If you're just doing a questionnaire, it says, recruitment will take 5 minutes and participation will take 10 to complete the questionnaire, and that's all. But time is a cost to people. They could be spending time with their family. They could be working and earning a living. They could be doing a lot of other things besides your study. And so if your experiment or your study takes a lot of time for the participants, that's okay. You just need to explain it here. And then it ought to be justified throughout the rest of your application. So you need to, in number 15, describe where the procedures will take place. And so not everyone went into very specific detail about this aspect in their procedure. And so if you didn't, then you need to go into it here. If you're conducting multiple procedures or there's multiple steps or there's multiple populations, you need to describe all of the places, okay? So if they're coming in to take a questionnaire, you need to do that. If they're coming in for treatment, you need to explain where that's going to be. Is it going to be in a doctor's office in the city? Is it going to be at a school in the lunchroom? Is it going to be on their personal computer or telephone? So each place that the participant is doing anything for your study, including informed consent, any parts of the procedure and debriefing, needs to be explained here. And so essentially, we ask this question because it comes down to a lot of ethics when it comes to confidentiality, making sure that where you're collecting their data, other people won't be able to see what they're doing if it's a private matter. Access to make sure everyone has equal access to participate. You don't want to make your participation, on the other side of town or in another country where people have to, get plane tickets or have a passport to get there. So this is an easy thing you just need to describe. You should already kind of have this in your head or even already in your procedure. 16 states that federal regulations require that you include minors. So unless you can, are you including minors in your research? If yes, then you literally just have to say yes. If no, then you have to explain why you're excluding this group from your study. And usually the no answers to this are explained in terms of your research question. No, the research question is only, no, we're not including minors because we are most interested in how middle-aged adults move through therapy in a 3-week intervention or something like that. And so you just need to explain why you're not including minors. Getting towards the end here, describe in detail your recruitment plan. And so this is one of those things you can just grab from your procedure. Who will be recruited and how? Everyone did a very good job of going into good detail about this topic in your procedure section on your research proposals. And so you already have most of this material done. And so you just need to explain who is doing what, where, and how when it comes to your procedure. Since this is literally just the question from an actual application, you'll see that it asks you to upload any of your materials like the flyers or the emails or the blurbs that you're going to include on your social media postings, upload them. And obviously you don't have to upload any recruitment materials here since this is not an actual IRB application and I'm not asking you to create recruitment materials. Participants, here you're further explaining your participants. They already asked you about vulnerable populations and special groups and minors. And so now you need to further describe all your participants, including your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And if there is inclusion or exclusion criteria, why? So why are you only recruiting mothers with 2 children or less? Why are you only recruiting people 25 to 35? Why? Those are the questions that need to be answered here when it comes to your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And you didn't explain the why in your participant section in your research proposal. And so here is where you need to do that. You can state the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have in your participants, and then you need to elaborate on it a little bit to give the reviewers an idea of why we're choosing this group of people to look at and not other people. Compensation. Will subjects be compensated or incur any cost for their participation? If so, provide details of the compensation. So again, most of you already have an explanation of this in the procedures section. And so you can explain that here. You might, depending on how much detail you went into your procedure section, you might just be able to copy paste it here about your compensation. One thing that you did not detail in the procedure for your section is any cost to the subject that may result from participation in the research should also be described. And so is it going to cost them any money? Are they going to have to drive somewhere? Are they going to have to get any types of materials? Are they going to have to do anything that would incur cost to them besides time, which is what we already talked about? And also, detail what compensation participants will be given if they do not complete the study. And so this is something to think about because a lot of you have in your protocol that participants who don't complete it will not be entered into the raffle to get the gift card, which is what most of you are doing for compensation. And actually, that's unethical because those people that opted to drop out or that weren't able to continue for whatever reason now are not able to get the same benefits that those who were able to continue were able to. Say someone has to drop out because they don't have a car, because their car broke down, they don't have enough money. And so now, since their car broke down, not only do they not have a car, but they're no longer eligible for your $500 gift card. And so really, you either need to really well explain very well why you've decided not to give those people that didn't complete it the opportunity for the compensation, or you need to change it in your research proposal to say that everyone that consents and starts participation will be entered into the raffle to get the compensation so that you don't end up in an ethical issue. If they're not really getting any compensation, then it's not an issue to worry about or that needs to be explained. Because we don't want to influence the decision to not drop out. That's essentially being coercive. So it's something you need to think about and explain. Benefits, we only have like 2 questions left. Describe the benefits, if any, to the subject and to society from your proposed research. Please note that compensation is not a benefit of participating in research. It's compensation on the IRB and the informed consent. They're described separately and they're separate things. And so here, what benefits might your participants get from participating in your study? Perhaps you're giving them a after-school intervention that's teaching them life skills and trying to increase goals. And so in that case, participants might benefit from the program by developing increased aspirations and career goals. Perhaps the benefit could include getting a whole assessment done or some information that they didn't have before, say if they're being assessed for certain personality traits or whatever. But most often in the studies that we design in this class, there aren't any direct benefits to participants. Rather, there's a general benefit to society. So the participant will benefit from this research because these findings will provide implications for the design of future treatments or the identification of, at-risk populations or yada, yada, yada. And so if there's no benefit to the specific participant as a direct result of their participation, there's generally a benefit to society, which is why we're doing the research in the first place, right? It's to answer an important question that will help better our society as a whole. But might be both individual benefits and benefits to society, or it might just be benefits to society. Either way, you just need to describe. So on the flip side, you have to tell them what the benefits are. You also have to tell them what the risks are. So you have to describe here the risks or discomforts, if any, and let me tell you, there are always some risks of mild discomfort, at least, to the subject. They could be physical, psychological, social. You need to describe them and then explain the means of minimizing them through your design. So if the subjects may become upset or require medical or psychological attention as a result of your research procedure, you need to describe a means of addressing that. So say you're doing therapy with people who have PTSD and you're getting them to write down their nightmares. Well, that might have a pretty high risk of creating more distress than was already there in the first place. And so how would you minimize that? Well, perhaps you just provide free therapy to these people for 2 weeks afterwards to make sure that they're okay after engaging in all of the procedures in your study. Or you provide them with consultations or a reference to someone or whatnot. And again, this is all pretend, so you don't actually have to find out how you would give them this 2 weeks of therapy. That's a good thing about doing a pretend proposal, and that you can just kind of come up with anything and not have to worry about it logistically. But if you're going to cause them any serious or physical or psychological harm, then you need to describe how you're going to fix that if that harm does manifest. A subject is at risk in the research if he or she may be exposed to the possibility of harm that is greater than ordinarily encountered in daily life. And so in some cases, your study might not do that. If they're just filling out a questionnaire, that might not impose anything that's out of the ordinary when it comes to risk or harm. So consider if your questionnaire asks them hard questions or asks them questions about things they might not want to think about, or depending on what your questionnaire is doing, it might make them feel uncomfortable. And so even literally feeling uncomfortable by the domain or the topic of a question is a risk. And it's not a big deal. Every study has risks. The idea is that you just need to identify them here. And then if it's a risk that's out of, greater than ordinarily encountered in everyday life, you have to explain how you will try to minimize that if it occurs. Last question, confidentiality, which is a big thing in IRB. So will the data contain any information that could personally link the subject to the research? If yes, Describe what identifying information will be collected. If participants' identifying information will be kept separately from the data using a key or a code sheet, describe the means of protecting these. And so a lot of you in your first round on the method said you would not be collecting any identifying information, and that's unfortunately simply not true. If you are doing a raffle for compensation and people are entered to win like a $100 gift card, then you're collecting their email address. That's identifying information. If you're looking at them within a school, then you'll have to know what their name is if you want to link it with like disciplinary records or something. So you'll need to know their name for that. And so I think almost everyone is going to end up having identifying information. If you have a procedure that's more than one part or one phase, if people have to do something this day and then something else the next day, you're going to have to collect at least some sort of identifying information so that you can link their data across those days together. And so almost everyone's going to be collecting identifying information, and that's fine. All we have to do is de-identify it. And everyone briefly mentioned that in their procedure section, or their analysis section rather. Here, you have to go into even more detail. And so I've given you some bullets here that you can actually use. So let's look at this. So, well, we can go back a little bit. Again, if you have any type of private information or information that's linked to their persona, it needs to be protected and kept confidential. So how do we do that? If researchers plan to retain individual identifiable information that if inadvertently disclosed, say someone broke into your office or you had an employee that was mad and wanted to publish all of it, that could place your participants at risk of harm. And remember, having any type of private information is a risk of harm. And private information, again, if you remember back to when we disclosed private, is anything that is associated with their personal identification and that would reasonably be expected that not everyone else has that information. If that happens, which most of you guys are going to have, researchers need to design procedures to protect the data during collection, storage, analysis, and reporting. So essentially, you can just kind of explain some of these things in this section here. So you might, as soon as you get the data, as soon as it's in the computer and you download it from your questionnaire, maybe you want to de-identify the data as soon as possible by substituting codes or random numbers for identifiers. So deleting their names and giving them a random number instead. You also will need to keep it somewhere really safe. And so you can talk about maintaining your code list or your email list for compensation or any of your other identifiable information in separate secure locations so that they're not stored together. Using accepted methods to protect against indirect identification, such as aggregate reporting or pseudonyms. No one really has any data like that, but that would be, say, if you were doing a qualitative study where you were looking at like 2 case studies, and if someone read the case study, they would be able to tell from it who that person is. And so no one's really going to have to deal with that, but you always want to say that you're going to de-identify it as soon as possible. You're going to save it in secure locations behind locked doors on a password-protected computer with secure internet connections, et cetera, et cetera. On my IRB applications, we literally used to say when we had paper data that was paper, but we also put it in the computer, but we still had like paper questionnaires and assessments and things of that. We would always have to say that we would store it in a locked office in a locked cabinet, and they're stored separately from the identifying information. So some of that kind of sounds silly, but it's necessary to explain in here. And so you can just kind of take some of these things here and explain what your identifying information is, and then how you're going to take care of it, make sure it's safely secured, and that it's also kept separate from the other types of information. Okay, So those are all we just went over all of the questions on the application that you're really going to have to think about and maybe elaborate beyond what you have on your research proposal. So what are the expectations for this assignment? Well, you're not expected to be 100% accurate. And accurate is in quotes here because there is no right or wrong answer. There's definitely some things that will be unethical and some things that will be ethical, but there's no exact right way to keep everything ethical. Really, I just want you guys critically thinking about this and trying to come up with ways to minimize harm, make sure it's equally distributed across participants, maintain confidentiality, make sure that all of them are voluntary and that there's no coercion through recruitment and things of this nature. And so it's all just about thinking about it. I'm not going to look at one of your answers and be like, well, that wouldn't be a very good idea because et cetera, et cetera. I'll provide you that in feedback, but I won't necessarily take off points for it. And so what are you being graded on if you're not being graded on getting the quote right answer? Well, you're expected to demonstrate that you've thought critically about the ethics that we outlined here and that are outlined in chapter 3 of your Stinger book, and try to the best of your ability to apply it to your design. So you want to just do your best to answer each question completely and to make it clear where it's applicable and relevant answers and questions that you are aware of ethical guidelines and have designed your study to protect them. So you wouldn't want to answer, say, that you're collecting data on children and that you're not going to do anything to make sure that you're protecting them as a vulnerable population, okay? You need to at least try and use the content from the book and from this to make it clear that you've been thinking about how to make this as ethical as possible while protecting your participants. With an IRB application, more is always more. You want to go into detail as much as possible. So essentially, when you submit these applications, the reviewer looks at it, they come back with questions or requests for additional clarifications, or even for redesign if something major in your study is unethical. But if you want to avoid that if possible, so you don't want to give a really brief response on one of these applications and then have them come back and say, well, what do you mean? Because what happens is that just takes time. It'll take 3 months for your application to get approved because you have to do 3 revisions versus 1 week for your application to be approved because you went into great detail and had good answers everywhere. And so for the sake of this assignment, any kind of explanation, you don't want to be brief. You want to go into as much detail as possible. And so a short paragraph for some of these explanations that are relevant to your study is going to be expected. So just some things to keep in mind. I've mentioned this before. You may need to elaborate more on a topic here, like confidentiality or why you decided to exclude some participants, than you did in your research proposal. And that's okay, and it's normal. You don't have to put that information into your research proposal. This IRB will ask for more detail beyond what typically goes in a proposal. And so just keep in mind that you're going to have to come up with some new content and explanations for a couple of these answers and explanations here. If while you're doing something, you realize that maybe one of the design aspects of your study actually isn't ethical, and to make it ethical and be able to explain yourself here, that you actually have to change part of your design, well, that's fine too. You should go, in that case, you should go into your research proposal and change that part of the design for your final draft. So say that you've now decided that everyone's going to be eligible for the gift card raffle. It's not only people that were able to complete 3 months and drive there every single day. And so that might be a change that you need to make, and that's fine. You can just make it on the final draft. Any other questions you have about this assignment, feel free to email me about them. But again, this is about critically thinking about these things, demonstrating on your explanations that you are considering all of the main ethics that we described here, like autonomy, confidentiality, justice, benefits, and things of that nature. And just give it your best go.